Pierre Krähenbühl is the Commissioner General of UNRWA since 2014. He just got in just before the 2014 Gaza war. And before being Commissioner General, he has been working for several years for the ICRC. I think that the ICRC has been also a big school for him to then succeed to the head of UNRWA. And I would say a warm welcome because he's at the end of a tour in several European capitals, among them Moscow, where there were minus 20 degrees, so in Geneva it's very warm. Mrs. Heba Ali, who will run the conversation and will moderate the debate during the Q&A session. Heba Ali is Canadian and Egyptian, and she, from 2016, she has become the head of IRIN News. I would say the most important press agency for humanitarian workers and agencies. After my introduction, we'll have a short speech by the Commissioner General, followed by the conversation. But before leaving the floor to Pierre Krähenbühl, I would like to mention two items which are part and parcel, I would say, of the importance of having tonight this debate around UNRWA with its Commissioner General. During the first 8 months of 2018, there has been a number of events that have been conducive the US to cut the funding, the American funding to UNRWA, and more largely a number of news justifications, things that probably Heba Ali, in her TEDx event, which you can listen on YouTube, Heba Ali classified them as junk news. What do I mean about that? The first one is that from Donald Trump to the Swiss Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Palestinian refugees have been termed as being part of the problem and not part of the solution. Now, this first point seems to me very important because UNRWA is not the creation or an invention of the Palestinian refugees or their leadership. At the end of the 1948 war, the UN General Assembly had a resolution, the famous 194 resolution, which was in some way a revolution, which was stating that the Palestinian refugees had the right to return and or compensation. UNRWA was tasked with humanitarian aid to the refugees, and the UNCP, the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, was actually tasked with the work of finding a political solution. The UNCCP never reached its objective, still exists as a dormant body. A couple of people sit in a UN office in New York, and UNRWA got the big chunk of the task for providing humanitarian assistance. Therefore, the first point we should not forget is that the UNRWA is a byproduct of the international community to find a temporary solution while a political solution had to be found to the problem. But there is a second related issue that was aired both by Donald Trump and others concerning the possibility of dismantling UNRWA and having UNHCR taking over. Now, since Donald Trump has been basically contesting the number of refugees, what I would say, inverted commas, find funny is that probably he didn't realize what this would mean if UNRWA was absorbed by the UNHCR. First of all, UNRWA never had a juridical protection mandate for the refugees. UNHCR has. Therefore, even if UNRWA has acted in a number of ways to protect Palestinian refugees, if UNRWA were to be absorbed by the UNHCR, at this point, the Palestinian refugees for the first time would have full juridical protection. Second, if today UNRWA assists 5.5 million refugees in the area between Jordan, Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, if the UNHCR had to absorb UNRWA, they would extend, I wouldn't say double, but largely increase the number of Palestinian refugees because it would take into account the Palestinian refugees recognizable as refugees outside the UNRWA area of action and would also include the displaced of the 1967 war. On top of that, it would increase the number because the UNHCR grants refugee status according both to female and male lines of descendants, while UNRWA just provides through the male lines. So what I wanted to highlight is that definitely a number of affirmations that are at best uninformed, at worst politically misguided, are actually something that we have been reading in the media with different, say, commentaries and discussion. So what better than having tonight Pierre Krähenbühl, who during the past 4 years, the past year in particular, has been striving to fundraise for the agency after the cutting of the US and other states. So thank you for being with us. I leave you the floor, and thank you again.
They're positioned a bit strangely, but I'll be as loud and clear as I can. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Bokum, for the warm words of introduction, for the opening comments. Very grateful to you for your very long-standing interest in the agency through your entire career and distinguished academic research, very valuable and I think an important reference in terms of UNRWA's work and the situation of Palestine refugees. Delighted to be here this evening with you. That includes you, Ms. Ali. Thank you for the opportunity of this conversation and for the welcome by the Institute. And Professor Burin, you're here. Thank you also to you and the entire team here at the Institute. It's nice to see so many friends and former colleagues in the room. A great pleasure to have this moment of exchange with you. And I will focus on a few things that were specific about 2018, undoubtedly a very unique and uniquely challenging year for UNRWA and for Palestine refugees. I would then focus also on a few issues that concern developments in multilateralism, but also in the frameworks that we inherited after World War II in international law terms. And then I would like to share, just in very straightforward ways, some of the biggest learning experiences that I have gone through since joining UNRWA in 2014, before then exploring some of the issues more specifically in the conversation with Heba. It is clear that 2018 was a very demanding year, first and foremost for Palestine refugees themselves, because it all began with the decision and the announcement by the US administration on the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the subsequent move of the embassy, and then followed very closely by the announcement by the US administration that it would cut 300 million. Actually, the announcement was that it would contribute 60 million US dollars to UNRWA in 2018, which represented a cut of 300 million to our organization. And later in the year, at the end of August, they then communicated officially that there would be no more funding to UNRWA going forward. In other words, we will lose this year the additional 60 million that had been preserved in 2018. That was the starting point for us. And of course, for a humanitarian organization, the loss of that size of an income represents nothing less than an existential threat to the pursuit of its activities and to its ability to both advocate for the rights and dignity of Palestine refugees, but in particular also to implement the important activities that we carry out on the ground. Now, we were determined not to sit back and complain for very long, but to roll up our sleeves, get down into the arena, and respond to that challenge. And it was a very important initial decision in January of 2018 to initiate a campaign that we call Dignity is Priceless. It is a campaign that I launched with two of our students in the Gaza Strip, young Karim and young Islam, both of them very passionate students in our education system in the Gaza Strip. And we launched this campaign actually symbolically. Karim, in his statement, time 14-year-old boy, picked the first coin out and put it into a box and saying, I'm making the first contribution to this campaign, calling on the entire world to unite behind it and show solidarity and commitment. Then we started on a very ambitious mobilization at a global level. And to cut a long story short, because it was a passionate, engaged, and very rewarding year, we were actually, despite many difficulties throughout 2018, we successfully closed a deficit of 446 million US dollars. And that is really a tribute to the extraordinary mobilization that was launched, but then particularly maintained and generated by member states of the United Nations, so the international community, so many countries, 40 different countries and institutions increased their contribution to UNRWA last year, but also a solidarity that extended to individuals across the planet, beautiful initiatives taken by people around the world to come to the support of Palestine refugees and to our organization. So, of course, we have many reasons to be very grateful and very positive about what happened last year. I can come back to some of the specific challenges that we then faced. I think that will be then more for the part of the conversation. Before I continue on UNRWA specifically, allow me simply to highlight three issues that come out of the years of experience with both ICRC and now UNRWA, and that I think are very important, that I feel very strongly about when thinking about conflict regions, conflict-affected communities. And the first is to say that I feel it is very important to reject the notion that wars are inevitable. And I know that this is somewhat counterintuitive for somebody who has spent most of his life with many of the colleagues present in this room working on humanitarian issues, because the very foundation of international humanitarian law rests on the principle that wars do happen, and that when they happen, the behavior and the means and methods available to combatants and parties to a conflict need to be regulated very strictly. That is the very essence of international humanitarian law. And I think one can frankly be forgiven when looking at most history books for believing that actually warfare has always been a core constituent element of the development and the history of human beings, man or womankind. Now, while I recognize all of this, I just have to say I will never reconcile myself with the idea that wars are inevitable. And the reason why I say this is because with many colleagues in ICRC, UNRWA, and of course many other organizations have that experience, I have lived and seen the catastrophic human cost of war far too close at hand. And the simple idea that we would somehow surrender to the inevitable notion that wars are inevitable is something I cannot accept. And I think the international community has a huge responsibility to shift the emphasis from what we have seen over the past 20 years, a collective fascination, not a very productive one, but a collective fascination for conflict management. And you can do conflict management for decades and you get 70 years of UNRWA, when in fact one should be focusing on conflict resolution. Of course, much more difficult, but that is precisely why you engage in it, because conflict, resolving conflicts, is something very difficult. But that is the only path to bring about justice, greater stability, and preserving dignity in the longer term. And I think this is something that needs a renewed focus and a renewed level of attention. The second point I want to mention is I am very much convinced of the necessity to equally reject and refuse the notion that suffering and death, pain and injury in situations of armed conflict is something that is allowed to be anonymous. Suffering, pain, abuse and violation in every single conflict is deeply personal or collective, never anonymous. And of course, every humanitarian organization and every media outlet uses statistics at times, and I might use some this evening as well. But I refuse the idea that Palestine refugees would be considered as statistics. And one way of underscoring this is simply to highlight that we have lost this year 13 students. Actually, in 2018, we lost 13 students of UNRWA in the Gaza Strip during the many demonstrations that took place in the so-called marches of return. And we also lost 6 of our students in Syria last year as a result of the conflict there. And if you allow me, I wish to name them. In Gaza, we lost Yasser, Shadi, and Majdi, all three 11 years old. We lost Ezzedine, a student in Gaza, 13 years old. We lost Mohammed, Zakaria, Hussein, Mohammed, and Wesal, all of them 14 years old, and Wesal, a young female student in our schools in UNRWA in Gaza. We lost Ala, Muath, and Jamal, 15 years old, and we lost Sadi, 16. And in Syria, we lost Aya, who was 12, Mohammed and Kusai, who were 14. We lost Baha, who was 15, Abdel Ghafur and Mohammed, also 15. There's nothing anonymous about them. They were, like each and every one of us, actors of their own destiny, with a potential and a hope about their lives and the future that would be mapped out for them and by them, and they lost their lives to intolerable situations of violence. We must refuse the notion that their loss is something anonymous and that did not mean anything significant in the larger scheme of things. The third point I wanted to highlight is the fact that we live in a time currently which is experiencing another round of deep challenges or questioning around some of the fundamentals that we inherited, the legacies of World War II. I think here, of course, after September 11, we had the challenge experienced deeply in ICRC around the questioning of the relevance of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. More recently, we have seen similar questioning by states of the relevance of the Refugee Convention. We see the challenges around the compacts on refugees and migration, and we see questioning around the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the lines I just want to quote here was something that was said in the debates after 9/11, when the Geneva Conventions were experiencing a particularly strong challenge by politicians, members of the academic institutions, but also in the media and in the general debate. And the quote was like this. Someone said, The question is about whether the Geneva Conventions were still adapted to today's challenges. And someone said, it is doubtful whether the negotiators of the Geneva Conventions, those who drafted and worked on the articles in 1949, had anticipated a world with Al-Qaeda in it. So, of course, probably quite likely that they hadn't, and that's a fairly factual observation, but not a very interesting one. Because the negotiators in 1949 had just survived the greatest calamity that mankind, and in this particular case I think we can underline for once mankind, had inflicted on itself ever in history. Everything from the Holocaust to Hiroshima, from Dresden to Coventry, had been done. And the negotiators in 1949 did not need additional imagination about the ability of human beings to inflict intolerable suffering on other human beings. And the very legacy of that calamity are these fundamental frameworks of international law. And to think that we have reached a stage in human history now, 70 to 80 years on, where we think that we can take that legacy for granted worries me deeply. And I think we need a resurgence of response to that challenge, and we need to stand very firm in the attempt to enrich these frameworks as opposed to questioning them further. Returning to the situation of Palestine refugees, let me just say that what worries me today the most is the total absence of a political horizon for this community. And the fact is that we can identify nowhere a structured, meaningful, genuine, or inclusive process that would bring about a political solution. And remember this point: the majority of Palestine refugees are today below the age of 25. In other words, they were born, it is a generation born after the Oslo agreements that has grown hearing from their own leaders and from the entire international community that if you believe in politics, if you believe in negotiations and in mediated processes, a solution will be found. But that solution has not been found. And so we risk losing an entire generation to the idea that politics works. Hardly a very promising development in the future of the Middle East. At the same time, I want to focus on the fact that, of course, while daily the lives of Palestine refugees are defined by the ongoing occupation in the Palestinian territory, by the effects of the blockade in Gaza, by all of the destruction and devastation of the war in Syria, we do not, and I do not wish to present Palestine refugees only as victims. Of course, they are victims of one of the great historic injustices, and it's something to focus on and to remember. But they are also, and that we see it every single day, they are people of great courage, strength, determination, investing in their own future and community with pride and very great strength. And my biggest discovery when I joined UNRWA after the years in ICRC, which is an organization, the ICRC, which has such a broad mandate, so diverse set of activities, and that I very much love to work with, my greatest discovery when joining UNRWA was the investment in education. 530,000 Palestine refugee boys and girls are in 711 schools that UNRWA runs directly, with teachers, education specialists, school principals that provide an education that is the basis of preservation of dignity and rights for this community. And to have seen that, to have seen 2 million, to have seen that 2 million Palestine refugees graduated from UNRWA's education system since the 1950s is a huge contribution to the preservation of opportunities and dignity in the region. And the crisis of last year, the threat to UNRWA's funding and the actual cut to UNRWA's funding represented a major threat to the preservation of that educational system. And that is why we call the campaign "Dignity is Priceless," because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, this whole debate and this whole discussion is not about UNRWA. It is about Palestine refugees themselves. It is about their future, their horizon. And it is clear that while we are very, very grateful to the entire international community for having responded so generously and with such determination last year, I would even say to have seen the entire international community vote that Palestine refugees matter, that their future is important for the future of the Middle East and stability in the region, nothing inspires me more on a day-to-day basis than the courage of our students, young boys and girls who cross checkpoints in the West Bank or who leave some of the camp environments in Syria, crossing in one case what was called the checkpoint of death in the south of Damascus in Yarmouk camp, because they know that at the other end of that checkpoint is the school that preserves their opportunities. And young Aya Abbas, a 9th grader in UNRWA's education system in Syria, was the highest performing student in the national exams last year in Syria. So first of all, most of you could be forgiven for not knowing that there are still national exams in Syria. There are, and it is a young Palestinian girl who achieved the highest results. She was born in Yarmouk camp, which lies today in ruin. She fled with her family at a very young age and finds the strength to be the highest performing student. This tells you something about the attachment of Palestine refugees to education. It tells you something about what UNRWA stands for. It tells you a lot about why the world came to our support, but it tells you even more about why we knew that we could not fail. Thank you so much.
We've just lost people already, so if there are any people waiting at the back, there are some seats at the front if you'd like to grab one. And thank you, Pierre, for those opening remarks. You are here in Geneva because this morning at the UN, you launched your annual appeal for funding. This year, $1.2 billion. And given the story that you alluded to of last year's experience and the response to the funding cuts from the US, I wonder how you see the outlook this year and whether those 40 countries that you managed to attract in a rather remarkable fundraising campaign last year will be preserved as you move forward.
Yeah, that's a very important question. That was very much at the heart of the appeal launch this morning with the member states here in Geneva at the Palais des Nations. The simple message is 1.2 billion for all of our services, education, healthcare, relief and social services, but also emergency response, is the amount that represents what is needed to keep the levels of services that we had last year intact and to preserve the response that we had last year. So there's no growth built into the budget. It is a preservation of what we achieved last year. Now, the simple message is to say to the donor community, if every single country that supported us last year could preserve the levels contributed in 2018, we would manage to cover the needs that we have this year financially. Now, in fundraising terms, everybody knows it isn't quite the way it works. Now, we have, of course, some countries have generously already indicated that they are prepared to increase some of the funding. Some countries have indicated that they will preserve the levels, and that's already encouraging. And then we have to count with the fact that there will be some that will find it very difficult to preserve the kind of levels that they mobilized last year. So it will take a lot of work, and I've also been very honest with our staff, 98% of whom are Palestine refugees, and with the refugee community, that it will remain a rough year to get the same level as last year. But of course, on the positive side, it is clear that the type of response that we had last year generated a lot of additional interest in the organization. I would say there was a form of rediscovery of what UNRWA stands for, the value of its services, and that is something that we can build on this year. And I must say that what I found the most encouraging in my visits at the end of 2018 and early 2019 to different capitals is, and I'll say it very, very simply, I saw a lot of genuine pride in the donor community to have been part of the solution. And so, as I said to many colleagues, let us ensure that we can really be happy about last year by confirming this result this year, but it's clear it will remain a big challenge.
Maybe just to give a bit of context, IRIN News is, like UNRWA, interested in telling the stories of the real people on the ground, as you were mentioning just now. So our reporting does focus on amplifying the voices of people who are affected by crises. But we also look at the policy environment in which these crises happen and the systems that allow responses to these crises to be successful or not. So I just want to give a bit of context and take us back, because last year was a dramatic year for UNRWA's finances, but hardly the first time UNRWA had financial challenges. And in 2015, you gave an interview to one of our journalists, and at the time, you said this was your most serious financial crisis ever. The next year, in 2016, again saying you were in the midst of a grave financial crisis of the magnitude faced the year before. In 2017, UNRWA warned that it was on the verge of a major funding breakdown. In 2018, with the US cuts, again, we heard that you were facing the most grave financial crisis in history. And I'm reading because these are all quotes, many of them coming from you. So, you know, it sounds a bit like a broken record. What is different this time around?
Well, at least we fixed the record last year. And we set it straight. So that was okay. But I think, you know, first of all, any humanitarian organization, it is very rare that one lives at the sort of levels that one would wish in financial terms. So my experiences in general, it is a very big struggle. But it's true that even by humanitarian standards, UNRWA's financial situation is definitely chronically difficult. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Sometimes when I'm asked what it feels like to lead UNRWA, I say it's like driving in a high-speed train, but somebody removed the tracks, because it's very, very bumpy. It's very challenging. It's not predictable. And in financial terms, you can read back, by the way, if you could take statements from several of my predecessors all the way back to the 70s, and you would find that it was very difficult. One of the reasons why I think historically the funding was not stable or sustainable was that the very concept of UNRWA was not supposed to be sustainable or stable. And the very first people who were concerned about messages around sustainability of UNRWA were Palestine refugees themselves. Because every time one spoke about UNRWA becoming sustainable financially, it was considered as a message that actually the political situation would not be resolved, and we would simply make the humanitarian part of the response sustainable. So that was not necessarily welcomed in the early years. In the meantime, we're in a different phase of the context, and I think at this point, UNRWA has made very big efforts in the last few years, in particular since these quotes, to save significant amounts of money internally also. So last year, for example, as part of the collective effort, we saved $92 million by internal measures. That's extremely painful for a humanitarian organization, but it was a necessary message to the donor community that we were also prepared to do some of the difficult work on our side. Now, just before the US cut its funding, we had begun implementing a plan that would have led to financial stability over an 18-month period. And that was, I think, something that was very encouraging, because we had agreements with donors, and also on our side had taken a number of measures. Sadly then, the US decision created a completely different disruption, and we moved from annual shortfalls of around 100 million to the 446, which is clearly a different league altogether. Now we need to come back to things that look for greater stability, and that will be our focus in the coming years.
But when you say even for a humanitarian organization, UNRWA is in a different league, what is behind that exceptionalism that you see in UNRWA?
So I think there's different aspects, maybe to focus on two of them. One is that a little bit differently from many other organizations, we don't carry out only the type of emergency activities that we are familiar with, food distributions, but in cash or medicine. when you face a deficit in such situations, you can decide you reduce the quantities that you distribute, or you focus and you target, or you limit the number of beneficiaries that you have. In UNRWA, we are, for a large part of our activities, a quasi-state-like service provider. And it is not possible for UNRWA to say, this year we have 530,000 boys and girls in our education system, and because of lack of funding, next year we will only accept 400,000. First of all, because you will have riots across the region, but also because there is a universal right to education. You cannot start as a UN agency to break that down into categories. And so that, in the operational model of UNRWA, includes and explains why we have a recurrent, challenging cost structure that will always be there, similar to what a state institution would provide. And because we've been there for a long time, and because we're a single-focused organization, it makes our fundraising exercises even more challenging. So if I compare to what I experienced in ICRC, and I'm sure colleagues in UNHCR know this, and many others, if you walk into a room, if my predecessor Filippo Grandi today walks into a room as High Commissioner of UNHCR, nobody knows whether he will talk about the Rohingyas this time around, about Afghanistan, Somalia, the Great Lakes, or others. You can talk about and put focus on many others. When I walk into a room today, everybody knows what the topic is. And we need to recreate a narrative around Palestine refugees that is both trustful to and consistent with the past, but also needs to partly reinvent the way we speak about the issue. Otherwise, we face major challenges in mobilizing international interest.
So I would challenge you a bit, because as close observers of the humanitarian response architecture, we see many of the crises that ICRC and UNHCR and others are responding to are the same crises year in, year out, South Sudan, Somalia, et cetera, for decades. And because the needs have proven to be so long-term, and yet the funding is short-term year on year, they have started asking themselves whether they need a different business model, that it doesn't make any sense to have this kind of emergency approach to long-term problems. And many of them have started asking the private sector to get involved, or looking at development actors that can start taking on some of the burden. And I'd love to hear, given the recurrence of the challenges and the exceptional situation that UNRWA is in, whether there isn't a more innovative business plan or business model out there to avoid ending up with this situation year after year.
So the most important would be that political actors take their responsibility seriously, bring about a negotiated solution, because what was foreseen under the Oslo Peace Agreement was a 5-year transition phase where UNRWA would have handed its activities back or forward to the PA. But let's stay with the current situation, because I think your challenge is very welcome. The reality is, first of all, we're not a self-created organization. We're tasked by the General Assembly, and what is laid out in the mandate as activities are very clearly laid out. And I actually think that when you look back, it was extraordinarily innovative by those who created the basis for UNRWA in the 50s to have included both the human development and the humanitarian emergency into one concept. It is, in my experience, quite revolutionary to see UNRWA being able to constantly shift gears from the same staff providing emergency response in Syria today that were the teachers who were providing the education the week before. In the Gaza Strip, I remember vividly in the war in 2014, that those who provided the emergency response in the schools, where 300,000 people were sheltered by UNRWA during the peak of the conflict, those were the very teachers, school principals, who a few weeks before had been ending the academic year for the children. This ability to shift back and forth is actually a formidable asset. Now, every organization needs to reinvent some of the things. One of the big changes we brought in recent years was shifting from food to cash-based distributions in several of the contexts in which we operate, because we think it provides better dignity, more choice for refugees, and is one of the humanitarian best practices that we felt, yes, we should integrate into the way in which we work. The longer term point that you raise, which is, can one bring in other actors, like the private sector or others? Yes, there's space, and we have multiple partnerships which are very interesting. But I have to tell you that when you mobilize 1.2 billion as an actor, you will need to base a very big core of that funding on governmental and state donors. There is just no, in my experience, other actor, at least in this type of response that we have, that has the leverage, the commitment over multiple years to sustain such a response. That I have not seen, and we certainly in UNRWA don't have the kind of reserves or financial depth that UNICEF, HCR, and others have to invest in private sector. That we don't have that leverage for the moment.
But where do things go from here? Because if we go back to 1948, and I understand absolutely that you have a mandate to deliver services, this isn't something you choose to do or not do. But you were talking then about 700,000 people. And today the number of people under your mandate has grown to 5.4 million, and the trend is upwards. Because it is not only the Palestine refugees at the time, but their children as well who are served by UNRWA. Is the plan just to continue relying on the goodwill of donors for year after year and generate? How many generations can you handle? You're not set up to be. It was meant to be temporary. So what's the plan moving forward? I find it hallucinant, if I can.
Yes, it is. But what is worse than hallucinant is the passive attitude of much of the international community when it comes about acting on the parameters of the conflict. This brings it back to my point earlier. There is nobody in UNRWA that believes that the future should be 10, 20, 30, 40 more years of UNRWA. That you will not find. This is just simply not the paradigm. We don't want to be the horizon and should never be anything approaching the horizon. We can keep personal, individual horizons open, but not the political one. And the political one has to be addressed. And nobody can say, in their right mind, that we don't know what the parameters are to bring about a negotiated solution between Israel and Palestine. It is not the concepts that are lacking. It's not the proposals. It's not the ideas in it. It's the political will to bring it about. And I go to many capitals where I see people throwing their hands up in the air and saying, we've tried it all, it's been there, this is an impossible conflict to resolve. Simply not true. Imagine Northern Ireland a year before the Good Friday Agreement. Do you think there were many people in the room who were not skeptical about the possibility of reaching an agreement? Or let's go back a little bit further. Imagine the first looks of disbelief in meeting rooms when Germany and France, after World War II, started to discuss whether the two countries could become close allies in building a new Europe. I can imagine that the skeptics probably outnumbered those who believed in that process. And the problem is, we surrender to the skeptics. That is what is impossible. And skepticism is one of the least sophisticated forms of surrender that I'm aware of. Skeptical attitudes is what allows you to just simply sit back and say it's very difficult. In humanitarian work, we engage precisely because things are difficult, not because they're easy. And conflict resolution is the same. It's hard work, but it has to be started seriously. That is the future of the business model, if you want to use that expression. And that is a political responsibility, because you're absolutely right. It was never foreseen that UNRWA should be in existence for so long, and certainly it is not my concept that it should be for as long as that. I mean, like many of you, when I was at school, I opened the history books and I read about the 100-Year War. And I kept thinking, I remember it even today. I can say, but how does that work, a 100-Year War? Well, we are just about there. And it's happening under our watch. And nobody can say that we didn't know about the parameters that should have brought about a solution. That's where we have to put the emphasis. And in the meantime, let us preserve the dignity of people and the outlook for individuals.
And yet, the diagnosis of the current moment could probably never be worse. We have a president in the White House that is moving the Capitol or the embassy and provoking these kinds of reactions. We have talk from David Kushner about dismantling UNRWA. You have a world that is quite distracted by wars in Syria and Yemen. Is this really a conducive environment for the kind of conflict resolution focus that you're talking about? It seems to me as though the Palestinian issue is off the radar completely right now. or if anything, getting worse, in fact.
Well, it is true that if you compare it to the 70s or 80s, let's say that and you look at the Middle East, of course, around Palestine and the Palestinian issue, many other conflicts have emerged that, by the way, deserve a lot of attention: Syria, Yemen, and many others. So that is clear that there is a focus that is a bit different today on the Palestinian issue. But look at what happened last year. So you have the announcement on Jerusalem, and within days you have reactions. Now, we can all discuss whether the reactions were the ones we expected, they were strong, not strong enough. That's not my issue, but they were. And the fact that the entire world, really, literally, so many countries around the world and individuals supported UNRWA in our effort means that people feel very, very strongly about this issue, and that they feel that Palestine refugees deserve ongoing attention. So I take that part as a positive. Now, again, you are right. It is correct to analyze whether the current environment is conducive. But you know, I think the Palestinian people, and by the way, for that matter, people in many conflict regions around the world, are sometimes exhausted by the number of reasons we present for why it's not the right moment. So if we stay with the US issue, every 4 years you have an election, so a year before the election's not the right moment. A year after the election's not the right moment either. You might get with a president who goes into a second term, says the saying, a better chance because mostly he said, but he or she doesn't need to be re-elected and therefore will be freer. Not that that led necessarily to a change in paradigm entirely. So explaining to people why it is not the right moment is like saying, please be patient for my inability to act.
But the reality is that
no, but the reality, let me just say, in Colombia, let me just give you the Colombian example, because I found that one completely fascinating. I worked in, and I see many colleagues who were dealing with Colombia in the room. For 50 years, this was a conflict that was going on, tearing this country apart, massive violence, displacement, death, and injury at a scale that was simply traumatic. And I remember very clearly in ICRC so many discussions year after year about the notion that this conflict would be forever unresolved. And then talking about conducive environment, of all people, we have the former defense minister becoming the president. And so, you know, one could have said, oh, well, that's not a very conducive environment for a renewed peace. And yet it was precisely he who then decided that the war had lasted long enough, the pain for the country had been too acute, and a change of paradigm was needed. So as always, it lies with political courage. And right now what we're seeing in the world is people, whether they are closer, and countries, whether they are closer to the Israeli or to the Palestinian perspectives, mostly show courage by confirming the side that they support in their opinions. That is pretty much the antithesis of political courage. Courage in political terms is to tell your friend that it's time to show a sign of moving in the direction of peace and making the necessary concessions for that. Courage is not simply surrendering to the realities of polarization, but insisting that steps have to be taken in the other direction. And I don't know if there's ever a right moment for peace. But the only thing I do know is if you postpone it, because political processes take years, every day that you postpone it has multiple ripple effects for people on the ground. And if we bring, as you rightly said, this human dimension into the equation, we cannot surrender and tolerate that we simply give up to political inaction that we see around us a great deal.
But I'm not asking what you believe is the right thing to do. I'm asking, in the current environment, are there any signs that that political courage exists?
Yes, I do think, of course. And if you would give a new generation of people a chance, or if you give people who face the consequences of the violence on a daily basis a different approach, yes, there are a lot of people. The problem is precisely because it's interesting how you formulated the question when you say you're not asking me what I believe. But actually, I can tell you, and very humbly at our level, we succeeded last year because we believed it was possible. Yeah? Not because we delegated it to somebody else. And that I say very humbly because the level of support was formidable from the Secretary General of the United Nations across to politicians and diplomats and students and everybody else.
but we believed it was possible to overcome what most people did not believe could be done, a 446 million deficit. So it is important to say what we believe is right. This is the problem. We're a bit in a phase where we don't say anymore, and especially on the issue of Israel-Palestine, fewer and fewer people dare to say what they think is right. And right now, what does the context need? Not more people who think they have to tell us what they individually believe is simply true. But what we need is to help the parties rediscover the humanity in the other. And that takes a lot of work and courage, because there will not be a solution without a recognition of the suffering that existed in the other community. This is just simply very clear. Currently, and that's why the decision and the accompanying narrative, Ricardo, you mentioned earlier, wanting to reduce the number of refugees in a sort of mechanical way, questioning the numbers, is not going to bring about peace. You don't bring about peace by wishing away an entire community of 5.4 million people. That doesn't happen. You integrate them. You show respect for their views, just as we can show respect for Israeli views and concerns that are fully legitimate to take into consideration in this regard as well.
You pointed to the fact that so many donors stepped up last year as a sign that there is, in fact, a willingness to address this issue in some regard. But many would argue that the funding that is given to UNRWA is, as one aid worker we quoted in a recent article, hush money, compensation given the lack of any effort to actually solve the problem. And others would go even further to say that UNRWA, as you said, being a quasi-government, is actually letting the occupying power off the hook and allowing this status quo to continue on end. And of course, it's not your mandate to resolve the problem, that's someone else's job. And as you've said at the top, your job is to make the suffering as little as possible until we get to that resolution. But how do you reconcile the fact that actually your work might prolong an undesirable situation?
So that's a really important point. So two aspects on first on prolonging, the risk of prolonging, and then on the other, how does one live with the dilemma? Because that's really important. So on the risk of prolonging, if anybody could give me an example where suspending humanitarian funding entirely, cutting funding completely to the entire humanitarian community would trigger instant political action to resolve the conflict, I would vote for suspending humanitarian funding immediately. Because nothing is more important than sorting out the mess of the Middle East in a serious way. So if that was the paradigm, yes, I would say, then let us have the courage to draw that conclusion. I have never seen, in my 27 years in working in humanitarian, that kind of a correlation. Never seen an example of it. And you're right, of course, in some cases, humanitarian funding is a substitute, or risks being a substitute for political inaction. Very clearly, that is part of the humanitarian dilemma. Then you added another dimension, which is how does one live with that dilemma in relation to the risk of, substituting ourselves for the responsibilities of the occupying power. Now that is a dilemma as old as humanitarian action, and it is particularly acute in the occupied territories because the Geneva Conventions, and in particular the fourth, of course, describe in some detail the responsibilities that an occupying power has towards the people living under occupation. And it is clear that that says, and in this particular case would apply to Israel, that they should live up to their obligations and cover financially also the needs of the population living under occupation. Now that hasn't happened, and then one can regret that, but I think what needs to be done, and the only way to deal with the dilemma is that while we carry out such activities, while we implement activities in a situation under occupation, we be crystal clear about our messaging on the obligations and on what international law says about that situation. There we cannot pretend. So if settlements are illegal, we call them illegal. Full stop. Settlements are illegal under international law. We don't start to call them illegitimate or using other words. They are illegal under international law, and we say it. We see violations like we saw last year in the case that I mentioned when I quoted the names of our 13 students who whose lives were lost in the Gaza Strip, or the many thousands of others who were injured. If I go to Gaza, I will speak about what that means in terms of disproportionate use of force by Israeli security forces. And by the way, I would not hesitate to speak about rocket firing out of Gaza if it aims and deliberately targets civilians. So there one needs a very, very clear message in order for the integrity of the humanitarian imperative not to be broken. I think that is the way we deal with the dilemmas. That doesn't mean it's easy, but that is the way we try to deal with it.
So I'm going to come back, because I'm still trying to tangibly imagine a way forward from here. Come back to my question about where are the entry points to change the status quo. So in the next year, given the alarming and expanding situation that you have talked about in terms of lack of freedom of movement, employment opportunities, increasing levels of food insecurity, psychological trauma, the blockade, the occupation, all of these things that continue year on year, what in the next 12 months could you see changing the game?
Well, right now, in terms of the immediate future, the paradigm is very difficult, there's no doubt, and that was your point. But I think what we need to just, sorry to repeat this point, we can discuss about UNRWA's approach the whole night, and you will not change the paradigm of the situation on the ground, because the whole idea of humanitarian action is that you provide a basis of human responses, preserving dignity, rights, and covering the needs of people in a situation of crisis. What needs to be changed is the political paradigm, the way in which it's dealt with. That is what is needed. And here I think we have a responsibility to continue to speak about the human consequences of the unresolved conflict. That is the very modest contribution we can make, and many others should be making, and many are making, to the ongoing awareness about what is happening in the situation. Now, of course, we will always run into limits. I personally believe that a much broader-based political process is needed, not with a single actor. It requires now a greater responsibility by more actors in the international community, different states to become involved in trying to bring about. But that is as far as my mandate goes in terms of the politics of it, because we're not tasked in UNRWA to deal with those parameters. But that's where the paradigm will be changed. Because remember that one of the things you will notice with almost every single negotiator that is sent into the region, the negotiators or the peace envoys start focusing on the big picture issues, the final status questions, Jerusalem, refugees. And after a few months, they speak about how much food is allowed into Gaza and whether a few hours more of electricity would be the breaking news item. This is the problem that we have, is that we shift from the big picture issues and we're brought down to the micromanagement of the implications of the occupation or the conflict. And I believe that the paradigm change can only come about by action in political terms. We can adapt some of the ways in which we provide services, and we do that a lot, but that is not what will bring about a paradigm change that you're calling for.
One approach that several diplomats I have spoken to have used with President Trump is a more transactional approach, not just to the Palestinian issue, but in general to resolving their challenges. And I have heard you and others allude to this kind of suggestion that funding cuts or a lack of support for UNRWA could lead to radicalization among Palestinian youth. And you mentioned the possibility of riots, you mentioned the risk of losing a generation. That I could see being a way of pushing things forward in galvanizing some attention towards resolving this, that if we don't do that, we will end up having more radicalization, more terrorism. But do you think that is a helpful or hurtful narrative for the Palestinian people?
No, I think one has to be very careful on what one projects on a community. First of all, Palestine refugees speak and should speak for themselves. So that is first, because I've never felt comfortable. I mean, I have to, and it's a very important obligation to represent the views and things that I hear among the community, but I would never say that I would express it as strongly as a Palestinian himself or herself, based on the many years that they have gone through the situation themselves. But it is clear that if you were to ask today Palestinians, they expect that we focus, and Palestine refugees, that we focus our discourse and narrative very much on a rights-based analysis, recognizing the rights that they have, communicating around them, communicating around issues of dignity. The risk with the argument that you raise is indeed to overstate the stability argument, and I would never formulate it quite the way that was summarized in this expression. I would say, however, is that the international community, and in many fora I am asked about what I think about the risks of further radicalization in the Middle East. That I'm asked about a lot. And when I'm asked about it, I often tell people that I'm surprised to not see more angry reactions at this stage, for example, in our schools and among our student body, considering the type of adversity, restrictions, conflict, and others that are faced by the Palestinian refugee community themselves. So I think one has to be careful not to overdo a terrorism narrative. That is not the paradigm. I'm not suggesting that if Palestinians don't, or Palestine refugees don't have access to education, the only reflex will be further radicalization. But I'm saying I can hardly see how that would be an investment for respectful relations between neighbors. And remember that today the Palestine refugee youth, just as the Israeli youth, are growing up entirely separate from one another. There are no contacts anymore in a general sense as the previous generations used to experience. If you're born in Gaza, you don't meet Israelis, and if you're a young Israeli today, it is very rare that you will meet, or very unlikely that you will meet in Palestine. Is that the basis for future coexistence side by side in respect of one another? I don't think so. We have to take care of these parameters.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, so do start preparing yours. But that is that in the age of Me Too and the kinds of narratives we hear from the Trump administration around, UN agencies and the UN in general being inefficient and corrupt, and more broadly, a much stronger focus by donors to agencies like yours of financial accountability. What are you doing within UNRWA to try to improve your practices? And I'll just list a few examples. I mean, UNRWA, as I understand, doesn't have an executive board, only an advisory commission. Auditors report to the executive leadership and not an independent body. You don't publish financial data on the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And you're not alone in some of these areas, but these are, I think, moving forward, more and more likely to be areas where donors will say you're not quite up to standard. And then on the sexual abuse and harassment side, we've seen now a number of agencies coming out over the last few months, in particular since the Oxfam Haiti scandal, in being more transparent about reporting their own incidents internally and sharing that with the public. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about, on questions of accountability in the current era, what you plan to do at UNRWA.
There's no way to manage an organization without paying attention to those issues, and if you neglect them, then you pay a price for it. And with this, I don't mean to suggest that we are up to standard on all points. That is very rare, and we have a lot of catching up to do in a number of issues, like many organizations, so that this is very clear. That's why, by the way, it is extremely helpful that there is scrutiny of this within the refugee community, from the outside. But if you look at the average UN Board of Auditors reports and reviews, which are very thorough, of UNRWA on a regular basis, we have very significantly increased the way in which we have addressed their core recommendations. And we have very few outstanding recommendations that are not addressed. Then topics come with greater emphasis, whether it is sexual exploitation and abuse, which the Secretary General has made a major issue, has very high expectations of us, and we have very high expectations of ourselves. And of course we are, like almost every organization on the planet, not up to standard at this point. There's no doubt about it, because that would be extremely surprising considering the objective lack of focus that has been given to this issue over decades. Now, the biggest problem when you establish a response that is more robust to the question of sexual exploitation and abuse is the trust among both refugees and staff in the effectiveness of the systems that you put in place. And that's why much of the situation we face today is still very much about underreporting. It is clear that in years to come, we will have more cases of sexual exploitation and abuse that will be reported through the, because we now have better systems in place. But for the moment, people don't trust that most organizations will actually do something about it. So that is something we have to accept, that there's a very big burden of proof on our shoulders, and we will be judged on what we do in years to come. So from corruption issues to sexual exploitation and abuse, these are all topics that are very high on the agenda. We will see in years to come whether we actually deliver well as we should on this. Just because you mentioned the US comment on corruption, or what the US called in a communication, UNRWA's irredeemably flawed approach and model, that is something that I publicly rejected with the greatest determination that I could. Because as much as I'm prepared to listen to criticism of the organization on some of the weaknesses that we have, and we certainly don't claim that we don't have any, it is a normal part of a conversation with any donor to be criticized for some of the things we do or don't do. That is completely normal. But to have thrown at our integrity loosely formulated comments about an alleged irredeemably flawed concept and corruption, when the US decision to cut funding to UNRWA had nothing to do with our performance, but was a purely political decision to apply pressure on the Palestinian leadership, I am not prepared to take those comments. And this is very clear. We will reject them robustly, in particular because a month before the US cut its funding, we signed a new cooperation agreement with the United States, in which, on the contrary, our efforts in managing the agency, the transparency and the approaches were recognized. That document is still on the website of the State Department. You have other things to do, but it is just there for you to be. So I am extremely clear in the dialogue with the United States. We will not accept that kind of criticism, because the core of that messaging is simply an attempt to delegitimize an organization that, by the way, the United States had been the biggest supporter of for decades. But we will take all the other topics up very seriously.
Questions from the floor, and we have a microphone here. So yes, the gentleman on the right. Yes, you, with your hand up. And if you can just briefly introduce yourself.
Robert James Parsons, journalist, Geneva. Could you please talk about the March of Return in Gaza? We're going to the end of the 10th month now. There are 3 points I'd ask you to address. First of all, at the risk of forcing you into statistics, how many killed and how many wounded by your reckoning? Second, I have heard from reliable sources that the flow of medical supplies into Gaza is slowly and steadily diminishing, even as the number of wounded from the attacks on the marchers rises up over 100,000, which would seem to be an effort to make it impossible to care for them properly. And then would you talk a bit about also the Israeli snipers' use of dum-dum bullets and what they mean under international law, what they do to the human body? So the statistics, the medical supplies, and then the dum-dum bullets, as we please.
And I'll take another question before we come back to Pierre. The lady in the middle here. To your right.
Thank you very much. My name is Rania Madi. I'm a Palestinian, and I represent one organization based in the occupied Palestinian territory. It's called Badil Research Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. I thank you a lot for your intervention, and I totally agree with you. Just I have one issue. First of all, I heard that there is the intention to close the UNRWA schools in Jerusalem, which is really, I'm worried about this. The second issue, I totally agree with you that there is no political will to end this suffering. But of course, I'm optimistic, as you said. We heard before about 100 years war, and at the end, and Algeria was occupied 130 years, and now it's free, it's country. But I mean, how we could really, as a Palestinian, I'm a refugee myself, I'm from historical Palestine, but I born in Ramallah. How we as a Palestinian, work more in order to to convince the Europeans, the international community to hold Israel accountable, because this suffering is for both, for the Israelis as well for the Palestinians.
Okay, so some very practical questions around numbers and education in schools, but also a bigger question around how do we break through and change the narrative.
Thanks. So on the numbers, UNRWA is not a data collecting institution, and it's always, I say this just, we know that figures and data in conflict environments are always something to handle with some care. But what we know, and this is something that struck me greatly, was that the figures and the estimates given for the number of civilians injured during the 2014 conflict in Gaza, and I'll come back to the specific question in just a second, injured in Gaza was around 12,000 injured civilians. As a result of the demonstrations that took place last year, we are now in excess of 20,000. Now, again, it tells you two things. You had 12,000 injured as a result of a conventional conflict using airstrikes, artillery, tanks, and all the other conventional methods that you can imagine in a war, and you had 12,000 injured after 50 days. Here you had individual days of protests, which were not exclusively, but largely peaceful, and you have over 20,000 injured. That tells us a lot about the dynamics of managing those protests. And of course, every side will have its views on that, but I'm telling you about the human consequences again. That struck me very much. And I'll just relate it to your third point. Again, we are not experts in analyzing the types of weaponry used. There are other organizations that have more expertise in that, and it's better to refer you to them. But it is clear that during my visits to the hospitals and our health centers in Gaza throughout the year, it is shocking to see the type of injuries. Lower limbs, knees shattered, ankles shattered. In other words, you will have thousands of young people that will live with lifelong disabilities and that compound the effect, the traumatic effect inside Gaza on the population of so many other problematic parameters that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. The medical supplies, our experience is that we managed to mobilize, but through a lot of work from our health and legal and other departments, to negotiate the safe access for the materials that we wanted to bring into Gaza for the work in our clinics. We increased last year, despite the financial pressure we were facing, we increased our response inside Gaza to the health challenge that was faced, and we're happy to give more details, if you wish, separately. The schools in East Jerusalem. So we've had a couple of statements by officials in the Israeli municipality in Jerusalem about intentions to close or to challenge UNRWA's presence in East Jerusalem. The position is clear. Our framework and the cooperation between UNRWA and Israel is regulated by an agreement that goes back to the 60s, and there has been no indication by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of any change in that regard. So I can tell you that at this stage, it is clear all schools of UNRWA, all health centers and other installations in East Jerusalem are open and operating. We will, of course, follow how that develops. On how to engage the narrative a bit differently, maybe, this is really difficult for me to tell you, because I think at the end of the day, this is your biggest challenge, and how to convey what you feel is the relationship with Europe and other parts. I find the strongest impact comes from humanizing the narrative. Of course, the Palestinian experience has been very strong and right, and understandably so, to focus very much on the international responsibilities, international frameworks, agreements. This is all understood. But you know how it is today in many of the international fora. You need to combine that with putting voices and experiences and concrete experiences at the center. To be frank, let me just give you one example of what I feel. I think today we have heard the word occupation so often, it has become an abstraction. But I say this not out of cynicism. I'm very worried about it, because occupation is nothing abstract. It defines the lives of people. And if I was, I was born in 1966, so the occupation begins in 67. Of course, the challenge goes back to 48, but the occupation in international law terms is 67. If I was born in Hebron, in Jenin, or somewhere in Gaza, I would have lived my entire life under occupation. That's what occupation means. And therefore, limiting the ability of myself or everybody around me to define their future in ways that are independent, respectful, and consistent with your own expectations. That's what occupation is about. As for the Algerian reference, I'll refer you to one of my colleagues who's Algerian, and she can tell you about how that felt and all the rest. Thank you.
Let's take 3 questions this round, and I'll try to diversify the room. So there's someone right in the middle here, and then we go up to the top. So let's start here, and then we'll go up afterwards. Yeah.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for these clear words and presentation. I'm Lucas. I'm the director of Voraus, the Swiss think tank on foreign policy. In my former career, I used to work 5 years with the Swiss Foreign Ministry on Israel-Palestine. UNRWA is one important piece of the international engagement in the Middle Eastern conflict. There are other actors like OCHA, there are like UN observer missions at the border with Syria, and so on. This international engagement has become a new battlefield for the parties to the conflict. You have the Palestinian side who is calling for a stronger engagement of the international community, who wants to go to the ICC. You have Israel trying to sideline UNRWA, Israel who kicked out the temporary international presence in Hebron yesterday night, an international observer mission that was present and supported by Switzerland in Hebron. And so it's a battlefield, and it's unclear. I share your vision that we need a multilateral approach to have peace, to achieve peace. So if I ask you, you wouldn't be the UNRWA commissioner, but the Swiss foreign minister trying to bring the states together at the table, a new Madrid conference. Where would you start? What are the challenges? And yeah, how would you go ahead? Thank you.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much. It was very interesting. You mentioned quite a few words that kept on coming back the whole time. And you mentioned integration. And I very much appreciated also Mrs. Ali when she spoke about the very special refugee situation of UNRWA, because we know that for about 5.5 million, there are over 30,000 employees, whilst for the UNHCR, for over about 68 million people displaced, there were about 11,000 employees. And speaking about, so how it goes on from generation to generation. So when you speak about integration, because I also know Palestinians who have got, for instance, Jordanian passports, and then they laugh, they say, well, I'm still considered as a Palestinian. And so apart from that, what hurts me also very much is when I hear that in Lebanon, for instance, the refugees in Lebanon, the Palestinian refugees, are not even allowed in hospitals. So how and I'm speaking about Lebanon, so how can UNRWA accept such a thing that these people continue in Lebanon and up to today not even be allowed to go into hospitals like any Lebanese person would do? So that means even beyond their own people, and there shouldn't be this suffering. This is inadmissible. And anyway, for me as a human being, I find this is very inadmissible. Apart from that, I know it's a lot of things, but a lot of things have been said, and everything is a bit quite global. So okay, this is more or less what I wanted to say. Now, you also insisted very, very much about education. A woman over here spoke about Jerusalem and that the Israeli government wanted to take over the teachings. And from what I saw in different reports, and there was one report that has never been given out, and it was a report that was done, I think, in the 2017 about the schools and how many employees of UNRWA and in the teaching scholar books, how much they were teaching about terrorism, anti-Semitism, and trying to steal Israeli children. I mean, personally, I find that's something ridiculous to teach. I mean, personally, okay? So as you spoke very, very much about education, I find that education and culture is very, very important nowadays, but one has to have a good, stabilized one. So when you were speaking about Gaza, because I had family also over there.
If I can ask you to just
Yes, okay.
wrap, just so we can give someone else
Yes,
an
what I do
opportunity.
know is that anyway, it's all the Israelis went out, I think it was in 2005, and so I don't see how they are going to correspond together. Excuse me.
I didn't understand the point.
Someone said that in Gaza, you said they don't meet, but how can they meet? I mean, all the Israelis went out, they were obliged to go out of Gaza, if I'm not mistaken, in 2005. This is a bit of a pity, because I find that when people mix up together, it's much better.
And one last comment.
Thank you
just
very
at the,
much. Thank you.
At the very bottom here. And then we'll come back to you, Pierre.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here for this conversation. My name is Ding Feng, and I'm a student at the Graduate Institute. And previously, I've also worked at Beirut, similar in education, but not necessarily with UNRWA. And my question here is, speaking of which, the recent attempt by the occupation of taking over the school, do you think UNRWA is able to resist it? Second of all, has there ever been precedents of the occupation trying to take over a school? And third of all, do you see there are any possibilities that one day UNRWA schools or even offices will be teared down by force and build an illegal settlement? And finally, my question is related to interagency coordination within the UN family in affairs that is under the management of UNRWA, whether certain UN agencies is able to share some of the burden that you are currently facing in your organization. Thank you very much.
Did you catch all of that?
So, first, a very interesting proposition of how does the world look like if one is the Swiss foreign minister. Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important for every country, it's just a general statement, to reflect on what is the added value that it can bring to a situation. So, of course, we know Switzerland was, for decades, saw itself and acted upon it to be a platform. Geneva was, of course, at the heart of that approach during the Cold War that brought countries and actors of conflict together to discuss, mediate, negotiate, and there was this space in the whole period of the extreme polarization of the Cold War. And we know that Geneva and Switzerland had to reinvent that concept because the added value of neutrality was less visible in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War. And I think probably our country is still coming to terms with that and trying to identify its role. Personally, as a citizen of a small country that has that as an identity, I think it's invaluable, and the core of the identity is help communities come together. Not predefine through one's personal views or statements what the outcome of a negotiation should be. And so I think the added value of Switzerland is precisely what you're alluding to, is to take initiatives to bring actors together. You know, one of the things, when I was a student at HEI, many years ago, I was always intrigued by something, and this, my former ICRC colleagues will forgive me for mentioning this. I almost did not join ICRC, actually, because of its insistence on neutrality, to be very honest. Why do I say this? Because I never understood why you would want to present a core principle that you have starting by a negative premise. In other words, when ICRC representatives came to present the organization to us when we were studying at HEI, you would have this beautiful moment. So you had Procter & Gamble in the morning and ICRC in the afternoon. And then you had ICRC explaining, we are a confidential organization, therefore I cannot tell you, and we are neutral, therefore we can't. And there's a certain analogy with Switzerland. And I always said to my colleagues, by the way, sorry for an additional parenthesis, one of the most fascinating debates that you can have is, by the way, how Switzerland became neutral. It was imposed on us by Napoleon and confirmed. The only thing that the Congress of Vienna agreed with Napoleon on was Switzerland needed to be kept neutral to keep it quiet, because it had been a troublemaker in the heart of Europe for long enough. That is how we became neutral, and ever since, we believed we invented the concept. That's an extraordinary achievement. Quite extraordinary. So neutrality, I find, you can interest people in neutrality only if it is action-oriented. A passive neutrality, I have to tell you, will find very little resonance or interest in today's world. So if I were the Swiss foreign minister, I would use neutrality as a strategic asset to bring parties to a conflict in extremely polarized environments together and to try and convince them that dialogue and resolving it is worthwhile. And I would put all my energy into that because that would be the trademark of the country. Now, to a large extent, part of that is being done, but there are moments where I dream of it being done more actively, and I think convening that is exactly what the added value of Switzerland would be in a very complex world environment. We need that to be reinvented to a certain extent. That I do feel very strongly about. Madam, you had a whole range of questions, so forgive me if I take a little bit of time, and Heba, you will forgive me, because these are very important points. So first of all, this comparison between UNRWA and UNHCR is interesting, but it's also intriguing because the numbers that you are using to compare, they will not fit. UNHCR is not responsible for 60 million people worldwide, because there aren't 60 million refugees worldwide. There are refugees and displaced persons for which there's an extensive interpretation of the UNHCR mandate, but strictly speaking, in refugee terms, protracted long-term refugees total around just over 20 to 23 million, of which 5.4 million are Palestine refugees. That is a very big share that the Palestinians represent of global protracted refugee communities, and UNHCR itself gives those statistics. The fact that we have 30,000 people employed is, compared to UNHCR's 11,000, again, comparing things that are not comparable, because UNRWA carries out its services directly. We implement directly. So the 30,000 is what you get. With all due respect to our colleagues in UNHCR, the 11,000 is not the end of the story, because UNHCR works with multiple implementing partners, that if you would remove those, you wouldn't have the entirety of the UNHCR response. So you would have to build into your calculation the thousands of other staff in implementing partners that the UNHCR works with to have the full picture. Finally, on that numerical element, the fact is that we run quasi-state-like services in the absence of a Palestinian state. If there were a Palestinian state, we would hand over our services, that was the plan under Oslo, transition our staff and our installations to the PA, and that would be a different phase of UNRWA altogether. So because of the absence of a Palestinian state, we have received a far more extensive role in that regard. Then you referred to integration and to the numbers. So let me say just another set of important points here, because we're often asked why it is that Palestine refugees are the only refugee community on the planet where the status of refugees is passed down the generations. This is one of the recurrent comments that we hear about, and very clearly, very often we confront this, particularly also from critical views about the organization. That is a very interesting comment to be made, but it's just completely false. So, however often it is repeated that Palestine refugees are the only refugees in the world that inherit or pass the title down the generations, it doesn't become truer. It remains false. And I'll give you an example. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans fled to Pakistan and Iran, mainly, initially. The hundreds of thousands became millions over the years because, of course, the children and grandchildren of the original Afghan refugees who fled the Soviet invasion were recognized and considered by UNHCR as refugees and assisted as such. There is strictly no difference in the way in which UNRWA and UNHCR apply the principle of family unity and therefore accept that refugee status is passed down the generations. This just has to be said very, very clearly because there's a sort of an undercurrent of comment about that that seeks only to suggest ways of reducing the size of the Palestine refugee community. And as I said before, we will not achieve peace in the region by wishing away an entire community. So under the UNRWA mandate, which again, we did not write, the international community wrote, member states wrote, Palestine refugees are those persons whose original place of residence was Palestine between a period in 1946 and 48 and their descendants. And the one big difference, and it's a very fundamental one, and here I will set aside 1 second the right of return itself, is that between a Palestine refugee and an Afghan refugee, just to stay with my earlier example, is that if I was the father of an Afghan refugee family and I'm sitting in Peshawar and have been there for 40 years, and I've seen my children and some of my grandchildren grow up, and I'd say, this has gone on long enough. There is an independent state of Afghanistan, and I can make the choice to go to it. This is the choice that is not available to Palestinians. And so I always say, if one is concerned about numbers, integration, the right of return, one should be at the forefront of working to ensure the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. That is what provides the paradigm which remains the international consensus, and I think is at the core of what needs to be achieved. You stated then that hospitals in Lebanon do not accept Palestinians. That there are individual cases where that happens, and I agree with you that that is not acceptable, but it's certainly not a generalized practice. Actually, people who are treated in our healthcare centers in Lebanon can be referred to Lebanese hospitals and will be accepted. We engage on that all the time. The challenge in Lebanon, that is the most severe, is that Palestinians are excluded from 40 different professions by law in the Lebanese context, and that is an impediment very much to the fulfillment, and of course, the horizons in professional and personal terms. That is a big issue that we deal with in our dialogue with Lebanon, and that is a parameter. But by the way, just as a comment, nobody really has an understanding of what Lebanon goes through with over 1.5 million refugees. So let me compare it to Switzerland. Lebanon has 4 million inhabitants, half of Switzerland's population. In other words, we would have by now welcomed 3 million refugees. So one of my good colleagues here in the front row is from Austria. I will take the hypothetical example that Switzerland would have welcomed 3 million Austrians. Yeah, but I can tell you that in the Francophone regions, that would set alarm bells off. Yeah, but this is, no, it sounds only funny in the Swiss context because we cannot conceive of a time where tensions would reach such levels that we would have, again, tensions inside the country, because we live in a country where we take stability for granted. That I'm immunized against, taking stability and safety for granted after all these years. working in conflict zones. So Lebanon deserves to be criticized where it's needed, but it needs to be very much recognized for taking on a proportion, because I remind ourselves here, for those of us who are Swiss in this room, that we have quasi-hysterical debate when it comes to welcoming 3,000 people. Yeah? So a country that has welcomed 1.5 million people against a population of 4 million, I invite any country in the region or in the world to think about those proportions against its population. And then we will see what that represents in that regard. The schools, I'll say it here as I've said it on numerous occasions elsewhere. UNRWA uses, based on agreements with host countries and UNESCO, since the 1950s, we use the host curriculum in our schools. So in Palestine, we use the curriculum established by the Palestinian Authority after Oslo. This is absolutely clear because it allows our students to continue their education once they leave the UNRWA system, and they can continue in the national system. I think it's clear. There's a lot of comments and public criticism about part of the content of the curriculum. We review the curriculum and the textbooks every time they are issued. I can say here with absolute clarity that there is no anti-Semitism contained in the Palestinian textbooks. There are politically sensitive aspects, just as there are, by the way, in every national curriculum around the planet. Of course, if I had time, I would look into some of the other curricula, but let's stay with the region. You can be sure, and there are international studies about it, that there are problematic representations in the Palestinian curriculum, just as there are problematic representations in the Israeli curriculum. The fundamental problem of both curricula is a lack of recognition of the other. And international studies have shown that this problem is as severe in the Israeli curricula as it is in the Palestinian. But we take great care in ensuring that political bias, gender misrepresentations, and age appropriateness are regularly reviewed, and of the thousands of pages of textbooks, very, very few contain problematic issues, and those that do, we discuss very clearly with the Palestinian Ministry of Education. We need to ensure that that is consistent with UN values. Then you said something about Gaza 2005. Not sure one could exactly formulate it in the way that the Israelis were forced to leave. I think my understanding was Prime Minister Sharon decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip. Now, regardless of the interpretations around that, the fact is, and this is a generally held view by the United Nations, I think the ICRC, though I don't have the final and latest updates of whether the legal thinking has evolved, that the territory of Gaza remains under occupation because of the forms of control that are placed around it. And my point is actually not even to go into the legalities. I looked at it as a factual observation. In my first visit to Gaza in 2014, I met leaders of the Gaza business community, all people aged between 55 and 60. And one of the business leaders in the Gaza context told me, "Commissioner General, I'm a good man." So I thought that was a great start for a conversation. And then he said, "But my children are not as good as I am." And that I found more unusual. And what he then said was, "I have grown up in constant contact with Israelis. I lived in the same neighborhoods. We knew each other. I worked in Israeli companies. I learned many of the skills working together with Israelis." I'm quoting him. And he said, "And although we disagree on almost everything today, I can still pick up the phone, call contacts in Israel, and we will disagree on the most things, but I can say," this is his quote, and I'm quoting him really very precisely here, "I can still say that I can understand some of the worries and concerns expressed by my Israeli friends or counterparts or former colleagues." He says, "But our children cannot, because they have never met or been in contact." So let us not create out of a withdrawal the idea that the current situation is sustainable in terms of good neighborhood relations. The reality is, I cannot see how it is in the interest of anybody's security concerns that you would have this form of coexistence in the region. I think both in the Israeli security considerations, the Palestinian security considerations, the Egyptian security considerations, and the security considerations for anybody in Europe. We need progress in the dialogue. And if anybody can explain to me how the current situation in Gaza is going to lead to stability, coexistence, mutual respect and tolerance, I tell you, I find it very, very difficult. And I'm never somebody who thinks that there's a one-sided argument to be made. But certainly the current paradigm is not going to lead to something positive.
He's finally being slightly pessimistic.
No, I told my colleagues throughout last year that pessimism is a luxury we don't have. The situation is far too serious to be pessimistic. It's far too serious, but that doesn't mean overlooking the realities that people face in human terms, and this is what you do, Heba, and that's what we do. We need to name things the way they happen, and we can be challenged about it. That's not a problem, including by different views. But we have to deal with that very clearly. On taking over the schools, you said, torn down by force. This was the question. Look, I think we have enough pressures to deal with that I don't have to speculate about events that can happen. My question would rather be, if an UNRWA school is torn down, what will the world say? That would be my question. But at this point, I have no indication in the dialogue, and it's a very sustained dialogue that we have with Israel. It's a very important dialogue, by the way, because we have very big issues that we discuss with the Israeli counterparts on international humanitarian law, on access. And I have been to many conferences where Israeli officials have, in the meetings, publicly recognized the humanitarian value of the work that we do. They will challenge other aspects of our work, but that we have a very open and necessarily robust relationship with Israel, which I think is a very important part of any humanitarian organization's work. The interagency burden sharing. So it is clear that there is an element of burden sharing that can be done. By the way, we have many partnerships where we cooperate with WFP, with many others in the UN family and beyond. But I just want to emphasize, when you have the scale that we work with, it is often very daunting for others to come. When you speak about an education program, you will ask most organizations, they will deal with a project for maybe 10,000, maybe 50,000 students. We have 530,000 students. And this is not to praise UNRWA in any particular sense, just the reality in factual terms. So at times it becomes a very big scope to share the burden in that sense. We can share activities, we can coordinate, we can complement each other in the response. That we do a lot with many actors in the context. So that's what I would say to all these, and happy if I didn't overlook anything. But
I think that was very thorough.
I think we could have gone on, I think, for the whole evening. And sorry for those who had their hands up, but I think we've run out of time. In fact, I think we've run out of many time. On behalf of Raymond Loretan, the president of the Club Diplomatique de Genève, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight, and on behalf of your alma mater, I'd like to thank you wholeheartedly for this conversation, which has been very open, speaking from the heart, as well as from the head. You were here 2 years ago, I believe. You will always be welcome to the Institute. Thank you very much. Thank you.